can go ahead and repost that. Okay, and so I'd like to go ahead and introduce all of you to Ms. Mamta Chand and Ms. Parisa Ali. They're both from Fiji in Suva, and I'm sorry, Suva in Fiji, and they're also from Generation 4 of the Pacific Islands Leadership Program. Welcome, ladies. I'm turning it over to you now.
Thank you, Lori. Hello, everyone. Really exciting to see you all. Paris and I, we have been a little anxious. We have been doing a lot of prep, a lot of reading, which I'm not fond of, depending on the content, but really excited to share our HerStory, our lived realities. So Paris, I might be just looking at the poll. I've closed it. So as you must, did you watch the video on discourse? Okay, that's totally fine. So what we're going to do is, it's a really informal chit chat. It's just a discussion where we'll be sharing about the HerStories of Girmit descendants in Fiji and the context of 100+ years before and the current context that we're living as young women with our multiple identities in the current political, socio-economic context in Fiji. So a little bit about my ancestry, my heritage, which is, I don't know. So yes, so when we start talking about our identities, when we talk about our ancestors, when we talk about our ohana, it's a real challenge for me because due to multiple reasons, I really don't know exactly where my ancestors were from. The only I was born into a family practicing Hinduism, so I automatically am practicing certain aspects of Hinduism. When, as a third generation, when I asked my parents, okay, what's our HerStory? Where our grandparents from? They don't know. The information was never passed. Sorry, the host seems to mute me. Something's playing out. Yeah, so that's one of the reasons that I don't know where I am from. No information, no HerStory passed down through the generations. And it's quite challenging because Pereza will talk more on that in terms of the race relations, the microaggressions we as brown women, we as descendants face in Fiji. That's my HerStory in terms of no HerStory and the HerStory that I've been creating as I go along with my feminism, with the work I do, and how I'm building towards the identity that I want to identify with. So I'll hand over to Pereza, who will talk about her history, HerStory, and the actual facts of our descendants and how it interlinks with the current context. So over to you, Pereza.
Thank you, Mamta. I know Mamta was unable to identify where in India she was from, but the discussions that I've had with my family, I was able to at least identify the major cities that they were from. So on my paternal side, my grandfather's family was from Lahore, and now I realize that Lahore is now in Pakistan after the 1947 partition. My paternal grandmother's family was from Punjab, and they were a full Punjabi family, which later converted to Christianity after they came to Fiji. My maternal grandfather's family was from the south of India, which is Malayam. And my maternal grandmother's family, they also came under the indentured Girmit system, but they were not from India. They were Burmese. They were from Myanmar. And he came as a young child. My great-grandfather was the only one that was born out of Fiji. And he came to Fiji as a teenager, and the only one out of all my great-grandparents that didn't work at the sugarcane plantations. He worked for the British in different sections as a watchman and later on as a supervisor. This is what I got from my grandmother, who is the only living grandparent that I have right now. And so there's a terminology that's used in Fiji when I sometimes tell people where my ancestors are from, and it's called Indians from a melting pot, because we come from all sides of India and we're unable to identify the exact locations of where our ancestors are from. Despite knowing where they came from, like the regions, I have no contact with any relative or anyone in India that I know would be from, you know, my grandfather's family or my grandmother's family. So it's completely no contact with the relatives that they had back in India. Now, looking at the history of Girmit descendants in Fiji, so the indentured labor system was formed after the abolition of slavery in 1834, and it was when the British colonizers realized that the newly free men and women refused to work on low wages, and the sugarcane plantations and the cotton and tea plantations that they had. So they introduced the indentured labor as a bonded labor, which it was instituted following the abolition of slavery. And from the period from 1834, when slavery was abolished, to the end of World War I, Britain had transported about 2 million Indians to work in the 19 colonies they had all over the world, which included Fiji, Mauritius, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, to name a few. Most of them from India that left due to poverty and famine, and in the hopes of finding secure employments. They were offered reasonable wages at the beginning of their agreement on the indentured system. Now, Fiji became a British colony in the year 1874, and the first ship of indentured workers arrived in 1879 on board the ship Leonidas. Leonidas, we had 40 ships arrive from a span of 37 years, which is from 1879 to 1960. But growing up, and Mamta would agree with me, our textbooks just covered the first ship, Leonidas. That's the only ship I know, and that's what we tell. We all came on Leonidas, but that might not be true. We might have come on the last ship. So our textbooks just covered Leonidas, and while we studied about the history of other countries and stuff, our history was missing from our own textbooks. So on board the first ship, Leonidas, we had 463 Indians that arrived. It took around 30 to 70 days journey on the ship. And over the span of 37 years, which I've said earlier, a total of 60,553 workers from India arrived, of which they say 75% was North Indian and 25% was from South India. But when they arrived in Fiji, that's when they realized that they were misled. Now, Girmit, we say we're descendants of Girmitias. Girmitias means agreement. It's a dirty word for agreement. So when someone says, I've been through Girmit, it refers to that period for us. Once they arrived in Fiji, they realized that they were misled. They were subjected to severe brutalities by the colonizers with long working hours and extremely low wages. We found out that men, women, and children as young as 5 years old were working at the plantations. They were whipped for small mistakes. While Mamta and I were researching, we came across this article. Someone had given an interview earlier on, and he said that the wake-up call was at 3 a.m. So if you woke up anytime after 3 a.m., you were whipped for that. And they were expected to work in all weather conditions, housed in cramped, often filthy, and given very little to eat and subjected to harsh discipline, which resulted in high rates of suicide, disease, and malnutrition amongst the indentured laborers. Women were abused both physically and sexually by the leaders of the cane fields. They were referred to as the sardars of the cane fields, as well as the colonizers. And Mamta was able to get some breakdown of the different types of women, the different caste of women that arrived in Fiji. So the major ones were the 41% was Brahmins, 9% Kshatriyas, 31% midland caste, and 29% low caste, with 16% Muslims women arrived in Fiji. At this point, I'd like to say that India does have the caste system, but it's something that's not at all practiced in Fiji. We never talk about caste because for us, we're all equals. And the traditional concept was that once you cross the Black Sea, the Kala Pani as they refer it, you are dissolved of any caste. And because that they were living in close proximity on the ships and the houses, and they were all treated in the same way by the colonizers, the caste system basically disappeared in Fiji. One of the ships that arrived, the fifth ship, Syria, which was a shocker to me as well while I was researching for this, was that it shipwrecked at one of the reefs in Fiji. And it had relatives who were already in Fiji, but it was a normal day at work and there was no commemoration done for the loss of life. So it was business for all, and they were not even given time to grieve of their loved ones that died. 59 Indian indentured laborers had passed away on that due to that shipwreck. So the colonizers played a major role in shaping the Indo-Fijians in Fiji. From an onset, they had separated the indigenous, which we would refer to sometimes as the Itoke. They were separated from the indigenous and the indentured laborers. So race relation was a reflection of their policy, and they were treated differently and minimized contact to prevent the ownership and sale of native land to these laborers that were coming in. The relationship was further strained when the Indo-Fijians refused. They were reluctant to serve at World War II because they were offered unequal conditions with lesser pay than the indigenous soldiers. And this was interpreted as a lack of allegiance by the colonizers. It's still evident in Fiji, as most positions in the military and the police force are held by the indigenous, while the Indo-Fijians have moved more into the private sector for employment. So at the end of the indentured system, which ended in 1916 in Fiji, a few of the Indians returned back to India, but majority stayed on because they had lost contact with their families and loved ones by this point. They had lost all personal ties with India. Most of them that arrived were uneducated and they had no means of sending some sort of communication back home. This was something that my grandmother told me, was that only a few of them were educated enough to send letters or post, and they were charging exorbitant fees. So the laborers were unable to afford it. So over the years, they lost contact with the families back then. And most of the Indo-Fijians that arrived in Fiji worked on the sugarcane plantation, and sugarcane became Fiji's backbone for over 100 years with significant contribution to GDP and employment. Sugar was the major foreign exchange earner for Fiji and still is one of the most contributing sectors of GDP, though tourism has stopped it over the last decade or so. At this stage, I'd say that a lot of businesses in Fiji are owned by Indo-Fijians. However, there's a difference. These are not Girmitians. They are free migrants that came to Fiji, say in the early 1900s, and in order to establish business. So they came on free will, and they did not at any point in time worked as indentured laborers in Fiji. So these are the businesses that Fiji has, and they are not descendants of Girmitians. So whilst the Indians stayed on, and by mid-90s, the Indo-Fijians became the majority ethnic group in Fiji. They constituted to about 50% of Fiji's population at that time. So they were around 300,000 Indo-Fijians of a 600,000 population. And the other 50% was made up of indigenous, other ethnic groups, as well as a small portion of Chinese nationals. So in 1987, during the general elections, the Indo-Fijian-led political party, the Alliance Party, came into power, and they were in power only for 31 days. It was immediately thwarted by the first coup in Fiji. I grew up with the terminology coup before I could even understand the spelling. It was something that was spoken by everyone. A coup has occurred, a coup has occurred, but my reality came in 2000 when I could really understand what it was, which I will get to in a little while. So in the 1987 coup removed the elected government. It was removed by the lieutenant colonel of the Fiji military forces. And his reasoning was a way to stop the Indian design of political domination. His argument was that if all the Indo-Fijian community converted to Christianity, then there would be much more similarities and common interest between the two major ethnic groups. However, despite the two coups that occurred in 1987, relations over the next decade or so until 1999 improved between the both groups. So the indigenous and the Indo-Fijians were able to find a way forward, living together harmoniously in a multicultural society. So in 1999, when there was another election, Fiji had its first and only Indo-Fijian prime minister, who was in office for 373 days, which is around 1 year and 8 days before we had the third coup in Fiji. And I was in high school when that happened. So this gave rise to Indophobia, and as well as ethnic tensions between the two major groups. It escalated in all sectors with looting and burning of Indian businesses and households. And it was also seen because the majority view was that the prime minister's ethnicity made him unsuitable to lead Fiji. This is when they came to work on sugarcane plantations, they were given 99-year leases. So these Indians were still living on those native properties where they were planting sugarcane. So when 2000 came about and this tension rose again, native leases were not renewed. So they were basically evicted off the property immediately, where they have spent generations living. And for the first time created a situation of internally displaced persons in Fiji, and an influx of squatter settlements around major cities and towns because Indo-Fijians moved to find, for livelihood purposes, to find employment. However, after several generations in the Pacific, for us, if you ask us today, we have changed based on our daily lives and the local realities and the contact with other cultures. I understand that the subcontinental Indians regard their authentic culture as being based on classical arts and religious orthodox, and it's something that we're all out of touch with. For us Indo-Fijians in Fiji, we consider the Pacific Rim as our home. And we've also, over the years, developed our own language. We're able to understand and speak the language that is spoken in India, but we have our own language, which we're proud of and which we're started to notice that the school curriculum now is changing and they're now teaching our own Hindi in school. It's something that's being introduced just recently. So all the Hindi radio stations we had were all speaking in the Hindi that is spoken in India, but now they're transitioning into speaking in our own mother tongue so that our kids are able to understand where we're coming from. So at this point, I'll move it back to Mamta, and she's going to speak a bit more about the microaggressions we face on a daily basis, as well as her lived experiences.
Thank you, everyone. You can take a deep breath and let it out. Flux of information. Yeah. So, and in terms of the HerStories, exactly what our session entails is you can see the HerStories of Perisa and I is such a construct in terms of our lived realities. And with that, I'm just looking at the poll. Thanks, Lori, for sending it. For number one, when you said, are you familiar with the story of Indian descendants in Fiji? 20% said yes. So right now, we're just opening the floor for our conversations in terms of what Perisa and I have shared, and also the polls. So I'd be really interested to hear from those 20% who answered to yes for number one, please. Opening up the floor now.
Should people just unmute themselves and speak, just as a reminder? Okay, so just unmute yourself and speak, please. Yeah, thank you.
Or if you don't want to address that, just opening the floor for any questions, any reflections you have, because also for number two, do you have similar situations in your country? I got the answer 100% said yes. So perhaps if you would like to share on that, but opening the floor for any conversations, any reflections, not restricting it to the poll. I like to be in a little bit of control. Yes, please. We'd love to hear from you all.
I'll say aloha, Mamta and Teresa. Christina, as you can see, another Christina. I live in New York. I'm originally from Peru in South America, a country which not only participated in the transatlantic slave trade, but was a site of the trans-Pacific slave trade as well. The blackbirding trade, in which thousands of Pacific Islanders were kidnapped and brought to Peru. My connection to Fiji, I spent quite a bit of time there, going back almost 25 years. And one of my dearest friends and senior colleagues is Imrana Jalal, who's quite a well-known figure in the Indo-Fijian community. And a dear friend of mine, Nalini Singh, is the director of the Fiji Women's Rights Movement, and so on. So I've been really blessed to meet a lot of very inspiring women in Fiji, particularly from your community. So yeah, it's amazing to hear your stories and to hear how all of these diasporas connect. My family is very multiracial and part of all of these kinds of stories in South America. So I really appreciate to learn how so many of us in different countries have similar kinds of things.
Thank you for that, Christina. In fact, most of both the women, I know of them and they're my heroes. And Nalini Singh is my boss at the moment.
Wow.
Yeah. Just Elizabeth, has anyone mapped the movement's migration patterns of historical ancestry? There's a lot of literatures and books written on it, even videos. But to have like the proper documentation, I'd say it's broken. The actual ancestry, the actual mapping is broken. And there have been individuals who have had managed to trace their roots back to exact places in India. And when they have visited India, they were not really welcomed. A huge percent, some of them were not really welcome. And this is the stories I've heard from individuals. They were not welcome, firstly, because it was also to do with money, land, that they assume that the family are now like, it's like a Bollywood movie, I reckon, that they want the land, they want the property, so they were not welcome. And the whole issue of the historical ancestry was like, we don't know you. Why are you here? It's been 141 years since the family left India, so we don't want you. So that it's quite complex and complicated, and it's a challenge to actually sit down and say, okay, what's our ancestry mapping? Because most of us don't have it. So it varies from family to family, from individuals. Yeah.
There's a question in the chat box. I'll just repeat it here. Has anyone mapped the movement's migration patterns of your historical ancestry?
I just answered that. Do you want to answer that?
I'm not really sure if they've mapped in terms of, I mean, in Fiji, our National Archives has the arrival cards, but the information in it is really limited. So we basically don't have much data on that.
And as Teresa was shared, it's the movements it is from all over India. Initially, most of it was from the north side of India. Quite a large population came from that side, but then over the years, within the 37 years, there were also people from South India. And then between that time, while they were still coming, partition happened, India and Pakistan. So there's another whole level of like, okay, how do we map this? And as I was saying, I don't know like my own ancestry, own mapping. So it's quite sad.
Mamta and Parisa, that was so interesting. There's so much that I learned from what you were able to share, and I'm sure there's so much more. I'm really curious, so you talked about how language is being taught now in the schools, language that you're actually speaking in Fiji, and clearly there's some conversation around this. Could you expand a little on how what's kind of spoken publicly about this history? How does Fiji as a nation sort of come to terms with this? And maybe even given kind of what's going on globally, do you see some change in that conversation too?
Thanks, Rajin, for that. Yeah. So firstly, as with our political history, I got a message here when people say it's like a sensitive issue. For me, I disagree with the term because it's a reality. And if even in Fiji, in the curriculum, and when just there's one day set aside, it's May 19th.
Yes.
It's May 19th, the day is celebrated. And coincidentally, the first coup happened on May 19, 1987. I was 3 years old. So within my own feminist spaces, within our own friends circle, we talk about it. We talk about our Girmitias, we talk about our HerStory, and we talk about identities. But when it comes to an outer space, when it even comes to nationally, it's quite frustrating that people or even leaders are still cautious. So when they choose to speak publicly about this, and this goes back to very closely with race relations, they're still cautious. It's just, for me, it's not being cautious, you're just being dismissive. You do not want to address, as leaders, as the power and privileges you come with, in the position you are to acknowledge that yes, we exist, this is our lived realities and what needs to change. So still there is a power struggle, even within my own spaces, even within the feminist movement, in terms of those identity and the microaggressions. I was in a space where I was with friends/colleagues who for me are quite well informed, quite privileged. And I heard some of them, I think that person didn't realize I was sitting in a space that, oh, they, meaning Teresa and I, they are taking over. And I'm like, excuse me, what? We're just like 37% at the moment. So with that conversations, it is still not happening proper. And when we start talking about the Girmit story, it's just like the Black Lives Matter. It's like, it's your story. You're supposed to take it forward. You're supposed to talk about it. Fine, we are doing that. But where's the space? We have to fight for the platform. We have to create the space. And then the privileges we do not come with, it becomes another whole layer of challenges and fighting for the space that we exist and we need to talk about it. Even simple thing as the language, as Teresa shared in terms of the radio stations, we were speaking, it was not necessarily even India Hindi because there's so many different dialects in India, but the Hindi we grew up with, it was mostly that. And most of us were like, that's not our language. We don't want to talk about this because I've gone on radio and I struggle to speak the Hindi they want me to speak. I speak my Fiji Hindi. So just last year, one of the radio stations, a prominent one, decided to use, broadcast in Fiji Hindi. There was a huge debate about it. Forget about from the indigenous community within the Indo-Fijian community, because the lack of information they have, if I may, they said that's not our Hindi. Fiji Hindi was not their Hindi. And I'm like, oh my God, you don't know your history. So even, and it also goes back to information, communication. We lack that. We still lack that. And it's up to the third generation and now the fourth generation to continue and push for this kind of conversations to really challenge the microaggressions that is there.
So at the political level, what's happening at all elections that we've been noticing, it's basically around race. Those that has more audiences, because right now the Itoke, the indigenous, are about 50%. 45% around that, and then the Indo-Fijians. I mean, we were at a stage where we were the majority ethnic groups in Fiji. But after the 1987 coup, when the Indo-Fijians realized that they were probably not welcome, because Mamta and I both have experienced this at some stage in our life when people had said, go back home, go back to where you came from. Where do we go back? This is home for us. This is where we've been. We're the third generation in Fiji. So all the elections has been around race. And the most recent one in 2018 has been around race. So at the political stage, they're very sensitive about what they want to discuss, because they know that within the Indo-Fijian community, there would be backlash if they started putting everything like Fiji Hindi on the curriculum, Fiji Hindi on the radio stations. There would be backlash from their own community. And for elections, all they want is votes. So majority counts. So they're really sensitive, and it's something that should not be, discussed at the political level, I feel like, is that they're so mindful about the votes that they're getting, that they're moving away from issues that are really sensitive to us and issues that should be discussed at that level. Because they want to please the majority in the community. So they're going to say yes to everything.
Just to respond to one of the questions on the chat in terms of recognition. So the biggest recognition is the Fiji Constitution itself, which says that everyone is equal, and it just talk about Girmitians, but there's not like an actual policy. Perhaps I'll be able to respond better to that since she's got that background that clearly states that separately. So it's not there. It's just a constitution that says like Indo-Fijians are equal, we belong here, we've contributed to the economy, just that. And that's what we know. And that's how we fight that we were born here, we are citizens, and we belong here, but not an actual big policy that really identifies and recognizes, okay, what it has been for 141 years, what we have contributed, and that we should be accepted.
Prior to the current government in place, when I was in school, there were different sets of policies in place for the indigenous community and the Indo-Fijians. So for example, in order for me to qualify as an Indo-Fijian to qualify for scholarship, I needed to secure 350 out of 400 marks in order to qualify for scholarship. Whereas the threshold for the indigenous was set at 280. So if you meet the 280, you qualify for scholarship. But for me, I had to strive for 350 because they said that the indigenous were disadvantaged. I don't understand where they were disadvantaged, but there were different sets of rules for us in order to access the same sort of rights that they were. So I missed out on scholarship, and someone with 280 probably got a scholarship. Just some of the microaggressions that we were facing in the community. Last year in Parliament, there was this case of stabbing, which Mamta would talk more about. And we had a member of opposition who belongs to an indigenous rights movement. And he said that stabbing and extramarital affairs were some things that as indigenous they were unfamiliar with. And it was us, the Indo-Fijians, who brought in issues such as extramarital affairs and stabbing into the country. Mamta, you want to talk a bit more about this?
On that, then it just all goes back to the race relations, the stereotype and prejudice that comes with being an Indo-Fijian, Fijian of Indian descent, Girmitians, and how we're looked at. And another huge part of this aspect of our identity, which may sound really weird to you guys, but it's Bollywood. This is how the Indian entertainment industry. There's this whole research that a friend of mine did on how Bollywood and other TV Indian soap operas has influenced the way the indigenous community looks at us. Because one interesting comment that I got when my indigenous friends started watching Bollywood and other TV series is like, Mamta, you are not like the girls on TV or in movies. And I was like, what do you mean? So mostly for TV series, because there's in terms of the stereotype of representation of women, Indo-Fijian women, Indian women, I might say, I did not represent that. Not in my saris. I don't wear sari every day. or how we dress and how we talk, how we behave. I eat meat all the time. I'm not religious per se. So all those children, I was like, so you, and then they think that they compliment us when they say you're not like other Indo-Fijian girls. It's just like a man saying you're not like other women or girls. And I'm like, that's not a compliment. You're again putting us in a box of how you want to see us, how you want us to be represented, but it should not be that. And this is not from the older community, not looking at Nick here. It's just even the 10th generation and the Gen Z now, like how stereotyped it is. So it's like a spider's web, a complex of continuing to fight for with all our intersectionalities that have for our identity, which for me, I've created as I'm going alone and as I'm progressing in my life. And I think for me, the privilege I have of the family support, me being part of the feminist movement, I've had this privilege to be able to reject the identities I want and embrace the way I want it to be or represent me. So that's my advantage. That's my heart story as a brown girl living in Fiji for the past 36 years. So thank you, Pres. So there was another interesting thing. Please do interrupt me if you have questions. I love talking. One of my guy friends just recently, when I told him that we'll be doing this, and he told me his grandmother said that how the colonizers made them breed. Breeding. So what would happen is they would identify a very strong man who would work how many number of hours on the field, and a woman who's also strong, because remember, women had multiple gender roles. They not only worked in the field, they came back home, all the gender roles, and then they were passed to how many number of men. They were like the colonizers, the overseers, the sardar. So like actually 2 women, 1 man, 2 men shared 1 woman. So there was that's part of like, so trigger warning, rape of women also happened. So when we talk about breeding, and then it was not a shocker for me, actually. It's like, so they chose this couple, the strong men, strong women, for them to create stronger babies. So that's how breeding happened. And I was like, oh my God, what's our identity then? Because we knew that, but to actually someone to say it out aloud, because I just wanted to dismiss that. So here we're talking about identities, claiming I'm a Hindu, but really, what's my actual lineage? And recently, why again we chose this session from my own close friends, there was a big debate online, and a good friend of mine told me to, quoting, go trace your placenta, go trace your bloodline. And that really triggered me, because it's a continuous conversation, but it comes from someone you love, someone you think believes in your principles and human rights. It was quite disturbing and frustrating. So it still exists, those kind of stereotypes, and like, we don't belong, like, where do we go? Yeah, someone, thank you for sharing. Yeah, it's like so easy to say, go back. Where do I go back to?
So there's a question here about, from Hira, also curious about how decolonization happened in Fiji, what the initial power balance between different ethnicities was at the time. This seems to have a big impact on how the post-colonial society in Pakistan shaped out.
So Fiji was gained independence in the year 1970, and this year we will be celebrating our 50th year of independence. By the time 1970s, the Indo-Fijians were the majority ethnic groups, and the business houses, who were the free migrants that traveled in the early 1900s, around 1910, 1920s, were quite influential in making decisions. However, the power was moved back to Fiji, back to the indigenous community, and they had what was called the Great Council of Chiefs. So we had Ratu Dakambau, who was our Governor General at that stage, and who had said that the triangular components of the Fijian land, the European money, and the labor molded of what Fiji was in order to gain independence. At that stage, majority of them who were Girmitiers were still working on sugarcane plantations. There was a very few that had any sort of influential role. Who had influential role from the Indo-Fijian community were the free migrants who had businesses and who were able to influence some sort of policy in Fiji. But even at that stage, most of the decision was based on race and was more towards the rights, protecting the rights and interests of the indigenous community. Which, later on in 1987, my mother tells us that they never had fences around their house because they never had any issues in terms of ethnic groups. She said the first fence went up in 1988 after coup. It's when they started protecting their households from their indigenous neighbors because of what was happening, the tension that they had in the environment. So despite having such a peaceful life at that level, there was still some tension up at the political level in 1987, which resulted in coup, which resulted that, yes, even though we might take the influence that you're giving, the money, but we would not let an Indo-Fijian run the country, because they felt that if that happened, there would be domination by the Indo-Fijians. And in 1987, after 1987, we had what was called brain drain. So those that were in a position to migrate moved within the Pacific Rim. They moved to Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Australia. Most of our families live within the Pacific Rim in these areas, and they're now known as twice migrants, whose home is now Fiji, who are able to trace back their history and say, oh yeah, my ancestors came from Fiji. So that's how I hope it answered your question.
Just a little bit, I want to talk about decolonization. This is in a different aspect of my own experiences. One of the most critical conversation when we talk about decolonization in my circle is colorism. When we talk about colorism, it's a lot because we grew up with the bombardment of the Caucasian culture. So in Fiji, when we talk about colorism, it's a huge, it's quite challenging for us as brown girls when we want spaces, but because of the color of our skin, because of what we represent, there's another whole challenge for us not to be represented in the space. So that issue of colorism, we take it decolonizing us. We need to decolonize that. That's one huge aspect that like I struggle with in my family circle. And also in terms of the colonial narrative of us, the colonial narrative of Fiji, the colonial narrative of the indigenous population, the colonial narrative of us, that's decolonization also. So we are continuing to decolonize that. And it's interesting because there's some people who do not want to be removed from the colonial HerStory or history because they feel that is the identity they have. And we can't blame them. There's like no judgment, because everyone has a different lived realities. Another question was in terms of the contemporary culture. Yes, for us in Fiji, certain aspects, I can speak as a girl following Hinduism, it differs from what we see in India, whatever we see in Bollywood movies and whatnot. Firstly, is the language that has changed, and there's different rituals. And I don't know, the colonial time, the horrifying ritual, one was where when we talk about honor killings, when we talk about the dowry system, when we talk about the widows in India, there's another whole conversation on how women are denied their human rights because of certain acts that happen in their life. That does not happen in Fiji. It's at a very minimal level when you talk about how the culture from India has trickled down to us. It's really different. But with the entertainment industry that we have been exposed to, it's strange how some of the cultures or traditions, rituals we did not we're practicing 2-3 years back is now been practiced, and it's quite horrifying because it's like that's not part of who we are. We've created our own identity. But then I again link it with decolonization, because we are doing that, but then you're still trying to bring that oppressive, regressive situations that is continuing, unfortunately, to happen in India in different parts, and Fiji is quite different from that. And some of the friends, of course, a safe space and whatnot, they have said that they're glad they were not born in India because of the status of women. And I mean, Fiji is no different in terms of our gender inequality, violence against women. That's another whole conversation. That when we start comparing, it's like it's more horrific in India. And then it's again in terms of the population, in terms of the caste system. And in Fiji, our lived reality is different for many of us young women. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Dowry is basically something, I mean, I was discussing with Mamta, and from my experience, I've never encountered any of the dowry situations. And she said that there is minimal dowry system within her community. And it's something that I haven't seen yet. So that was something I didn't touch on, because Mamta was saying that there has been a bit of dowry system among the Indo-Fijians. But for us, because I practice, I'm a practicing Muslim, we do not have any sort of dowry system based on what the ancestors passed on into Fiji.
Hi, Elizabeth, can you explain on your experiences in Philippines in terms of brown girl, if you're okay with that?
Oh, I just can you hear me? I'm not so sure. Okay. So sorry. Maybe later on you can go ahead and talk. I just need to get my headphones.
Okay, sure, no worries. Because when we in Fiji, in the context of brown girl, we're reclaiming it. We are really powerfully reclaiming that term. And yes, with all the current context that is happening in the world in terms of being women of color, people of color. So it's like we are flipping the narrative of it being dirty. That's us, we exist, and we are reclaiming it. So that's another whole struggle of us in Fiji in terms of reclaiming us, reclaiming our identity, and ensuring that the narrative from here changes, and it's not a sorry or sad narrative, but the reality and the harsh reality, the facts, and this is what it was, but this what it should be now. And that's another power struggle for us in Fiji when we talk about identities. Open to other questions or comments?
I think the older generations, the second generations perhaps, they're still finding it difficult to come in terms with the brown girls concept. So they still prefer people who are light-skinned within their own community, especially when it comes to marriages and other sectors, other aspects. They would prefer someone light-skinned over brown-skinned girls. And it's something that our generation is really advocating on and trying to educate the older generations on this. We have seen people being discriminated on that within our own community.
Everyone looks so serious. I think we're going, I don't know, probably 10 minutes or something left, Lori?
Yes, you have a you have enough space to answer a couple more questions.
Okay, great.
I'm curious if there are spaces in which women across cultures or groups, so indigenous Fijians and Indo-Fijians and others, are there spaces where women are having conversations about these issues and sort of ways forward that are more inclusive?
Thanks, Gretchen, for that. So with my work, I work with diverse young women, and for a different, for political leadership context, we brought like younger women, older women together for a national forum. And in that space, and that's something I struggle with working in the feminist movement, representation of Indo-Fijian young women in various spaces. It's really, really low due to so many reasons. One of the indigenous participants stood up in the national forum of 100+ women, diverse women, and said, where's the representation of Indo-Fijian young women? And again, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of sensitivity, so even when I've talked about this, I've also challenged it, where's the representation of Indo-Fijian young women? And when we set partisans, I ensure that representation is there. Again, it goes back to people just like shut down. They're like, it's like it doesn't exist. We don't want to talk about it. And unfortunately, it falls back on us to continuing to push for it, to talk about it, to dig it up. But then in terms of like even mental health and the energy and the exhaustion, how far can we go when we don't have a support, when someone is not there standing with us? There have been spaces women do come and talk about it, but just to a very limited extent, and then shut down, then it goes on to another cause. And then they see us as like we're hounding. We've been called that. You're continuing to hound the space, but we don't have a space. Yeah.
Yeah, these are really great conversations that all of you are having. And we would love to like continue this conversation even after this session is over. I know we only have about 4 more minutes left. So if anyone has any questions, we can take at least one more. Okay. If not, we can always continue this conversation over in their Discord channel. And we highly recommend that you go ahead and do that. You know, post your questions, post your comments, and then Parisa and Mamta will be jumping in there every so often to kind of answer any questions you may have. You can also, if you want to do a voice, you can also do a voice chat in the voice channel as well. But just know that that one is not recorded. But yes, we highly encourage everyone to continue the discussion. We've also posted the link for the next Zoom session with Joshua Cooper, as well as the link for the evaluation for Mamta and Parisa's session. And again, we would appreciate all of you if you go ahead and fill that out, because it will also, it'll help them as well as the Eastwood Center staff with programming. Any last words, Christina?
Mahalo. Thank you so much for getting us started. Confident about the week with your start and your intelligent comments and willingness to share your personal stories, both of you. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. This has been amazing. I think an excellent opportunity for us. Seriously, when we applied for this, I just saw it and I just messaged Parisa, should we do it? She said, do it. It was just like a quick thought process and not, yeah, so it was just like that, like we did it, because I think this is really important. Even when part of the Asia Pacific Leadership Program, I think this kind of conversation is really important to create when we go forward after COVID-19 in terms of the leadership program. So yeah, thank you again. Thank you so much, and hope we can continue this conversation on Discourse. Take care, everyone.
Okay, before you go, we have to do, I forgot the group video. I mean the photo. I don't know how to do this, so I'm just gonna take it with my phone. Oh. Fun times.
Probably Fifi can help us with that.
Okay. Fifi, can you do it?
You
I
can
don't
just
know.
screenshot it. I'll screenshot
Okay, I don't know how
it.
to do that.
Yeah. Okay. 3, 2, cheese. Got it.
Okay, thanks everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Naka.
See you in the next session.